All right. Well, JoAnne and Craig, I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you. And before we dig into the conversation, I want to tell you a quick story about how I came across your book. So I've been working in ocean technology for the past 10 years, and we started building these open source underwater robots. And it was a really interesting experience, and we're building this kind of global community. And at the end of that kind of decade of working on that, the thing we realized that was really lacking, that was holding back the whole field, were just kind of simple standards around connectivity and connectors. And it sounds so subtle, but it's actually this really important problem that the entire field had been unable to solve. And so I started thinking about how we might do that, and started just doing more research into standards in general. And the more you dig into it, the more you realize a few things. One is they're absolutely ubiquitous, right? I mean, this
everywhere.
They're everywhere, and standards make our world. And they're also a really powerful, they're a powerful tool and a powerful engine for development. And in doing this research, I'm looking at CubeSats and I'm looking at different things. I'm trying to piece the story together. And the whole time I'm doing this, I'm thinking, wow, there needs to be a whole book written on that. And thankfully there is, and you both wrote it.
Yeah.
And it's called Engineering Rules, and the cover and the title are both wonderful. And the content is really good. And I think this is, my personal opinion is this is like a textbook. This is the background. And I hope this is a jumping off point for a better standards discussion everywhere. So that's my story about how I got interested in standards. I want to know how you two got interested in standards.
So an interesting story in itself. So we're married, but we're in different fields. Craig is in international relations, and I'm a business historian and teach at a business school. But for decades, we've been saying one day we should write a book together, since we both have a historical bent. And that had been sort of in the background for a long time. And eventually, and we'd occasionally throw out a topic and it wouldn't go anywhere. And I don't even remember. Do you remember who threw it out?
I think Beth was one of the people who suggested
studying standards. And suddenly, when we got this topic, it suddenly
it seemed like it
both
clicked.
Of us.
I study international organizations and international cooperation, and the way in which the UN system actually operates, which is kind of, it's 100,000, a few 100,000 people who are in the field. It has nothing to do with New York or Geneva. It actually has to do with people actually doing real jobs and that sort of stuff. And most of it is actually about industrial development. I mean, that's really what the UN is about. And I'd learned a tiny bit about that there existed this private standard setting world in the course of some of the work that I'd done, and it sounded real interesting. And
of course, firms are central to it, because they're the people who are part of this, the standards committees are typically engineers from companies, or wanting to buy the thing being standardized, or a third category, which is engineers who don't have an immediate interest in it, monetary interest in the standard, but are representing the common good, the common interest.
Right, often university-based people, but
So we got into it.
So we got into it, and it turned out to be really fascinating. I mean, part of it was just we both enjoy the hunt aspect of these things, because this was one of the, in some ways, part of the research process was closer to some things that I'd done previously, where records don't actually exist. Or at least they don't exist where you think they are. The UN throws away, deliberately does not keep its records, because there's a real problem that the governments, like the United States and China especially, if you keep the records, then they'll figure out what's been going on and get mad at you. So I'd known about going to find records in people's basements and in odd places. And standard setting, it's the same sort of thing. There's this nest of organizations.
Yeah, the organizations don't keep records. Individual people keep records. So the people who chair those standards committees keep them. So we were, going literally into people's attics and basements. And in at least one case, after the guy died, his daughters let us in to look at his records. So the records are not in the obvious places where you look for them. When you write to the standards organizations, they say, "Oh, we don't keep records. We could never keep all those records."
Well, if they're kept by anybody, it's by the organization that's the secretariat of one of these committees. And then you go to the secretariat organizations, and they go, "Oh my God, no, we can't keep all those records, blah blah blah." But the records kept. They're engineers who do this, right? And typically the chairs of committees and sometimes the people who are acting as secretary of the committees
will keep
some records and keep sometimes tons of them.
So we really had to sort of network to find people who had records, and
oh my gosh,
it was a very different experience.
It's a very different experience, but it was fun. I mean, we did attics and basements, garages.
So it was an incredible detective story on top of being this really, I mean, I'm assuming you felt the same way that I felt, where it just feels like the more you really dig into this, the more important it actually is.
Yeah. So I think we both came to realize that everything around us, our whole world wouldn't work if we didn't have standards. I mean, our being on Zoom with you, I can't tell you how many standards are probably involved in this, and it wouldn't be happening if we didn't have these standards. So, so many things just wouldn't work. And it's easy for people to say, "Oh, the companies are too involved," or they'll come up with, negative things about the process. But the fact is, if it didn't happen, we wouldn't have the technological world we have today.
The scientific.
Nothing would connect, nothing would,
So that's true. I completely agree with you on that. And there's also not, like there's ISO and there's these kind of these institutional bodies. But if you're someone like me who recognizes this problem, and there's an industry kind of in your way that no one's really incentivized to improve it, there's also not a good blueprint for someone to go and actually become a standardizer or become a standards entrepreneur. And that's kind of, anyways, we can talk more about that later. I think the big question I have for you, and this is the question I have had in doing my own research, and then of course in reading your book, and I can't wait to ask you it, why do you think standards are so underrated?
I think it's partially because the word standard itself gets used in a couple different ways. And one of those meanings sort of bleeds over into the other meaning. And, we think of standard as being, blah, meh, not of interest. So there's that meaning of the word standard. And I think that bleeds over. And that's part of it. And I also think people think of it as the most boring possible topic. And I mean, for us, that's been part of what's been so interesting. The whole project was fascinating. It wasn't boring to us at all. And yet,
maybe there's something wrong with us, but
we found it fascinating. And most people, once you start telling the stories, see that it's really interesting, but it sounds boring. It sounds like all it is, making things all the same.
Yeah.
But it's not that. I mean, it's creating the basis for interconnectivity. And as you know from your own project, which of course you need standards, you can't do innovative work if you don't have the standards that allow the people who
that you can build on. I
mean, that's the sort of the key thing. The other thing
he's starting to ask something.
No, I was going to say, like I have a whole, half my questions here are around language, around like some ideas. I want to throw them out to you later around language. But I think there is, so I'm in Silicon Valley. I've run tech startups and done this, and there's a narrative among kind of techno capitalists that companies change the world, that entrepreneurs change the world. And if you kind of bring up this alternative idea of, well, maybe techno-cooperation actually has an equally important role.
Yes, indeed.
And there's a real kind of fierce pushback to that, because they kind of need to justify the mechanisms that they have in place for funding companies and creating wealth, which I think is great. But I also think this idea of techno-cooperation is really underrated and underinvested in from a personal perspective and from a like a institutional perspective. So no, I guess the other thing I want to know from you is, what has been the reaction to the book?
Yeah.
Oh.
Interesting. So before I answer that, can I first say one thing to your techno point, and that is that Tim Berners-Lee, we think of Tim Berners-Lee as having created the World Wide Web, and people think of him as an inventor, but what he's most important for, in my view,
and he understands this himself,
is creating W3C, the standards body for the World Wide Web.
Right.
He understood that to make that continue, to make the web be what he wanted it to be and grow in the way he wanted it to grow, it needed to be standardized, and it needed to have agreement across a broad swath of people. So you can mix techno entrepreneurship, in a sense, with standards entrepreneurship, although he chose not to go the direction of making money off the technology. He chose to instead become part of the standards thing.
There's also a historical, we live in a slightly different period than some of the earlier periods that we talk about in the book.
Yeah.
In the late 19th century, pretty much all the way through the middle of the 20th century, standards making was considered one of the cool things that you did if you were an engineer and entrepreneur at the same time. So that some of the founding figures that are there in those first few chapters are people who are Britain's Thomas Edison, and these are major people in the Siemens brothers, who did a pretty good job of creating a company that lasted and worked pretty well. The Ericssons, folks along that line. And there is something about the current computer era, the Silicon Valley era, where we don't have that many people. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee is still an example of the same kind of person, but the vast majority of the people that you're going to run around with in Silicon Valley are not.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm sorry.
I would agree with that, and I would agree with that, and I would also take issue with this idea that there's not so many people here working on it, because I think there's I actually think there are people working on standards, but it's taken a different form in open source software.
Yes.
That's right.
A lot of the energy is there.
Is there? Yeah, I think that's right.
And the interesting thing about that is they use a lot of the same language. There's a very much the same ethos in the open source software community. And this was, the reason I bring that up is because we were part of something called the open hardware movement about 10 years ago during the maker movement. And we thought we're going to share our robotic design online and everyone's going to iterate and it's going to work. And we were trying to copy what we saw happening in open source software.
Yeah.
We were going to give the designs to the world. And this was the Arduinos and the 3D printers. And there were a lot of really interesting ideas being thrown around. And there was a lot of enthusiasm around it.
Yeah. But
it never took off, and it just didn't work to copy the open source software model in the hardware space. And this is but the thing that I realized is that was actually the right idea. What we were actually should have been doing is focusing on standards, not on trying to copy and paste the open source software model.
And maybe working through either IEC or ISO or ANSI, the American National Standards Institute.
Right.
So I'll tell you something else about this, because this is an idea that this is my own theory, and I want your reaction to it. Is, we came into the ocean tech space as outsiders. We had a different kind of vision of what ocean robotics and technology could be. And that's helped like a lot of other companies get started in our image. And there is some cooperation amongst that group. I think so instead of going through like the traditional, ISO or the IEEE methodologies, what I'm seeing is there's some standards entrepreneurs who are taking a slightly different approach. And to me, it's very reminiscent of what Clayton Christensen described as disruptive innovations. And so I call these disruptive standards. And you think about like the professors at Stanford who created the CubeSat, right? That was not Boeing and all the aerospace engineers getting together and saying, hey, let's create a way for really low cost satellites to go into space, because they're very comfortable with the high cost of going to space.
Right.
So these two Stanford professors, following the Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation model, where you find a group of outsiders who need something and you start there, they created the CubeSat model. And then they created the Peapod launcher so they could piggyback on launches.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, the CubeSat is really the unsung hero of this space renaissance, right? Like it's a big percentage of SpaceX's. Are you familiar with the CubeSat?
Not very much, no.
You should look into the CubeSat standard. So I'll give you the short story. So it was two professors, one at Cal Poly, one at Stanford, who said, it'd be great if our students could launch satellites into space. And so they created a standard, a 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter cube. And they created this Peapod launcher. And NASA agreed that they would attach this Peapod launcher and launch student experiments off the back.
Yeah.
Well, a bunch of really innovative students thought, well, we can do interesting stuff with this. And so they created phone sats, and because the lower cost of launch, they started launching imaging satellites. And that's what created the company Planet and Spire, and all these companies built off the CubeSat standard. But this wasn't something that NASA did. It was something that they kind of barely condoned. And this new group of entrants were able to come and build the standard. And now this is, like I said, SpaceX is using, this is a big part of their business, is taking these groups up. So I think this, like, in my mind, it's kind of going back to what I said. I think engineering rules is like this is a great foundational piece for even more thinking around standards. So I'd love to hear your initial reaction of my disruptive standard entrepreneurs.
So I think that's very interesting. There are some advantages to the old model. And if the disruptive model can find a way to copy those advantages, then I think it would be great. Because the disadvantage of the old model is it takes too long. It's a very long and painstaking process. But the thing that it has achieved is that it does have, the consensus means that when the standard is actually launched, it's always voluntary. People don't have to do it. But the reason people do is because they've all been involved and they've all had their say and they've all agreed. So, consensus takes a long time, but it gets you something that you don't get any other way. It gets people really excited about it. But what you're talking about is one that isn't so interested in getting everyone on board, but starts, in a smaller way and gets a bunch of new people on board and tries to build a new kind of thing out of it. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah,
it could be made to work.
Well, and it reminds me of this paper by, someone we mentioned in the book, at the end of the book, a Chinese guy who's sort of the guru of standardization in China, Wang Ping. And he had a recent article, or recent paper, I guess it's published by now, but that's where he was saying, looking at the consortia that exist in where you're getting a consortia around a particular standard in one field or another. And he was trying to theorize when a consortium is a really good thing.
Instead of the standard. The old way.
And what his theorization actually is exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. I mean, if he were sitting here rather than us, he would be going, yes, you have articulated what I was trying to think up. That's exactly it. Because what his point was that using some of the norms and activities of traditional standardization if communities of people who are trying to create really innovative, useful technologies were able to do that, then that would be both a helpful thing from the point of view of the world. I mean, that's really, but it would also be a way where, he thinks there are lessons from traditional standard setting that could be used by people, by folks like you. I mean, that's the thing that he was trying to, I think, really get across in the paper more than anything else.
And I think that's right. And I don't think it's either or, to be clear. And I think the box, the container example might be a better example, right? Like McLean and company have this idea for containerization, and that's going to be a more effective way to ship things around the world. So they go off and just do it. And then they prove that this is a more effective way, that this is going to be a more efficient way for intermodal transportation. Then the rest of the community sees that. Then we're able to go back to the drawing board and bring everyone to the table and understand, okay, let's all get together and really hammer out what this standardization process is.
Stage,
So it's like one group, kind of I call them the disruptive standard entrepreneur, but they go off and prove that this alternative model,
I see what you're saying.
Is going to work, and
I think it's really
they can. Because I think what we have to think about is, like, someone like me, it's very hard for me to, even though another paradigm was possible in the ocean tech space, it was very hard for us to do it because the existing Teledynes and the big companies were selling to the oceanic institutions and the Navy, and everything was fine for them. It's it's almost like you need, in order to get to the paradigm shift, you're going to have some people who are thinking outside the box. And so I think thinking through this idea would be useful. It could also just be that this is my perspective and I've been an outsider.
I think it's a great idea.
Well, and I think your CubeSat example is neat, because one of the things that is part of it is that, students can come up with these out of the box ideas. They're not committed already to the organizations that are already up there.
Whether the companies or the governmental purchasers or whatever.
I mean, it does make you wish also that the various billionaires who've been going into space this last week or so would have done a little bit of coordination.
Well, the space thing is interesting because, here we're talking about, Bezos and Musk and all these things. But you didn't even know the story of the CubeSats. I mean, this is just a perfect example of how, which is almost the most important story of all these folks. And Bob Twiggs and Jordy, the professors who did this, are kind of riding off into the sunset. One of them sailing around the world, and so it's like, I just want to make sure that story, is included when we talk about this era of rejuvenating interest in space, because I think, there's an economist at George Mason named Tyler Cohen who blogs a lot online, and he has this kind of theory of the great stagnation, which is, it's kind of this famous Peter Thiel line is, we wanted flying cars, but all we got is 140 characters. It's like, why are we only innovating in the internet space when, like train travel and air travel and all this other stuff is slowing down? Well, it may, like, one, possible, component to add to that question is, well, there was the standardization work is just a really important element to the innovation ecosystem. And if we're not keeping the ground well fertilized, we're going to start to bear less fruit. And so I think, like, how do we make sure that this discussion is involved? And this gets back to the language question, is like, so the question for me is, or question for you is, I think you're right to say that standards kind of sounds boring. It's like, it's almost like amateur. I love amateur, innovation, but I think it's got that wrong connotation. The weights and measures work to me is like, that's important for safety and all these things, but there's some standards that are different, right? Some standards are incredibly enabling, like the container, like the internet. Do we need to think of new language to describe the goals or the ambitions of some of these standards?
So that's interesting, because we already have some of that. Like, compatibility standards,
Interoperability.
interoperability standards. If you think of them in terms of that, most people in high tech would understand that you have to have things be interoperable. So that sort of notion, if you modify the word standards with a word like interoperable standards or something of interoperability standards, because people too often think of standards as being sort of lowest common denominator, and that's not the point. It's this interoperability is often the key, and if we can keep that piece of standards in the forefront, I think that sounds better than just standards. But did you have another kind of word in mind?
Well, I like the enabling standard, but like, let me tell you a story about that speaks to that truth that you just mentioned, which is we had kind of started bringing this up, this ocean connector standard idea with other companies and investors, and we weren't getting that much traction. And all of a sudden, when we said this is going to be like the USB for the ocean, it's like all of a sudden that interoperability idea just like made things click. And we didn't have to sell the big vision, because the big vision is that this is actually going to change the paradigm, that we're going to have lower cost platforms and lower cost sensors, and they're all going to work together. And this is going to actually enable a whole new way of working. But actually, that wasn't a good way to sell it, because no one was interested. Everyone is like so busy with their own way of working. They don't really want to think about the new way of working. The interoperability was actually an effective language to use, which is interesting, because I'm only motivated to do this, not because of interoperability, but because I can see the next paradigm, and I'm really excited about that. And I think, this leads into another question I have for you is, I can see your mind spinning about it, but this work seems to attract idealists.
Oh yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So
major finding.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think we call it in the book, we call it a social movement around it, because people were true believers in standards. They really believed that standards could save the world in those early days. In more recent days, with IETF and W3C and those kinds of organizations, they believe the internet can save the world, and that having standards is essential to keeping the internet functioning. So their focus is less on the standards per se than on the internet that the standards enable. But you have to have true believers, because there's a lot of work that goes into this process, and people do it. It's volunteer work. The term for this is voluntary consensus standard setting, and the voluntary can be used in two ways. It's voluntary in that companies voluntarily adopt the standard, but it's also voluntary in that the people who do the work
to a great extent
are, their company may be supporting them, but they usually, if they get into it, they put in way more work than they're getting paid for it. It's one of those very absorbing things, and it takes an incredible amount of time and lots of other things in your life. One of the standardizers we studied, who had just died before we could interview him, but his daughters gave us access to all these documents from him. And one of the things that became clear as they gave us more and more documents is that he was spending a lot of personal money. He was a college professor, so he wasn't getting paid by a company. And he was spending a ton of personal money to go to all of those meetings all over the world, and he worked on it all the time. And he was so devoted to it. He thought it was the center of his world. That was the most important thing, and he cared about it. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, is this a philanthropic opportunity? And I'll add in addition, I'll put an addendum on that, which is, how can we improve the process of standardization? Are there other tools? I mean, there's a paper from the economist Michael Kramer, who won the Nobel Prize for a lot of work, and also did a lot of stuff around advanced market commitments, which advanced market commitments are where this great idea that improved vaccination, like the Gates Foundation put up $1 billion to pre-buy pneumococcal vaccines, and they did it at a set price. And so all these companies whipped into gear to create these vaccines and then distribute to the developing world. And it was wildly successful, this idea of advanced market commitments. But Michael Kramer also put forward this other paper around patent buyouts, which is something that's a really interesting tool, like a potential tool of, well, maybe we can have folks, because, you know, like you think about, like, you know, in the case of the box, right? Like where, you know, these kind of entrepreneurs kind of reluctantly gave up their patents, like for the greater good. I wonder how much, you know, if there's a role for some group, whether that's philanthropic or government, to really think hard about potential patent buyouts in different spaces, because it might not be a whole lot of money that it would take to get firms to buy into these ideas.
I like
that. No, I think that's a very good idea. I mean, because that clearly, one of the slight problems of the current moment is that the likelihood of people within lots of companies thinking that their intellectual property actually might be worth something, if it were to be turned into a standard, seems to be greater today than it was 2 generations ago, certainly. And it's almost all cockamamie. I mean, you know, the likelihood that any particular part of intellectual property that would be part of a standard actually ever being valuable to you. So it's not like this, if you had this philanthropic system that's doing this, it's not like it's going to have to be terribly, terribly huge amounts of money. It's just enough money to get you over the sort of crazy idea that maybe this thing that you have actually is going to make you money at some point later on.
That's exactly right. So that's what we're doing. We had some philanthropists who came in and bought some IP, and so we're doing this with this connector. So it'll be an interesting case study. Because you know, it's not that, like, you know, maybe it's valuable or whatever. It's also just the time, right? Like the time that we're going to spend documenting it and doing all these things. And I'm interested to see if this works, because I'm forgetting the name of the researcher, but there was a paper that came out, I think, a decade ago or 2 decades ago, Why Standards Fail. And it was an interesting, I thought it was an interesting resource. But, you know, the failure of commercial adoption is kind of one of the big reasons that standards end up failing. And so what if if these things come out of firms and they're already kind of adopted, will that help them on the path? Because that's where they originate. Anyways, it should be an interesting test. I'll keep you posted.
No, it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, these are really, you're coming at it from a different slant than a lot of people. So it's some very interesting ideas about how to try to get by some of these problems.
So what do you make of, so I just think it's such a rich idea, and that's why I'm so grateful for the book, because I hope it spurs more conversation. And you know, the other groups that I'm interested in your take on is this whole crypto scene, because, and I know you write about this a little bit in the book, but you know, this is this dynamic new you know, generation that's, you know, thinking again, like we did with open hardware, like from scratch, like doing the kind of first principles of how do we set standards. And it's exciting. So what's your take on the crypto scene?
Well, it was very interesting studying the Web Crypto API standards. But I don't know anything about the technology itself, but there were very different attitudes. There were 2 very different sort of approaches that people took. One was the approach that says what you want to give is a toolkit with everything in it, and then let people choose later. The other was that you want to actually figure out which ones aren't safe and get them out of the toolkit, you know, and just have the toolkit be ones that are really safe. And that was the big tension in that committee. Is this supposed to be prescriptive or descriptive? If you're thinking of grammar, the 2 ways of thinking of grammar are prescriptive versus descriptive. And in a way, that was the argument they were having over crypto stuff. You know, do you want it to describe what's out there and what are all the possibilities and the toolkit that people can work with? Or do you want to say, these things aren't safe, this thing is safe at the moment, so let's go with what's safe? And
so it's kind of, So that's interesting. So when you look back at the history of standards, what was the more successful approach, the prescriptive or the descriptive
Yeah.
route?
Interesting.
It's interesting
I'd
because
have to think about that for a while. Wow.
the thing that jumps off the top of my head, and this might not be true, but is that that cultures, including national cultures, played into this. The Germans in the early part of the 20th century were much more prescriptive in everything from building standards to I mean, really, even though the goal of all of the kinds of standard setting was simply to create standards where there would be a lot of variability, but the tendency on the German side was to give you exactly measurements for the what the window is going to look like in the end that's going to stop all the cold.
Well, I think the descriptive was often used at the international level to get it past the consensus thing. So the way you did it was you said, okay, we'll consider all of these container sizes to be, we'll describe what the different national ones are, and then we'll say they're all standards, and then let the market sort it out, which is what happened with the containers and the ones that
they got it down to 3 sets of standards, but the standard was 3 sets of standards, and then the market got rid of 3. Got rid of
and
2.
so the one that they ended up with was the one they would have declared prescriptively at the beginning. That's the one they wanted, but they didn't think they could get everyone on board, and so they did it in this kind of sneaky way of describing these 3 and then letting the market sort it out.
So that's probably really the bigger lesson, is that the sneaky way works best.
Well, at least in cases where I don't think in all cases that's true, but I think in cases where, particularly international ones where you have different nations have their own favorite in the race and are not willing to give it up, it can be useful to have
but would that work with cryptography? I mean, that's anyway, it's a
you might want to come closer.
I want to tell you something else I've been thinking about. I just want to put this on your radar and get your reactions to it. Is earlier in this series, I interviewed Elizabeth Irons, who's the CEO of a company called Science Exchange, and what they are is a marketplace for laboratories like labs for hire. So like scientists can go on and say, I need this much, I need these gene sequenced, and people bid on it. And her the entire value proposition of their company, and it's turned out to be really valuable for biopharma companies, is that they can come with this protocol that they need done, and then they know all of the the labs that are in the marketplace, which is hundreds at this point, are vetted. And so what she described is their company created all of this value through contractual standardization. And I know that in Silicon Valley, I've seen this happen. There's these things called safe notes, which Y Combinator really kind of pioneered, which is a simple agreement for future equity. And it really streamlined early stage investing. And so I think there's this whole idea and realm of contractual standardization. And I think this is kind of what Airbnb is. I think it's kind of a trust platform, uses technology to create trust, but I think it's also these interesting tools of contractual standardization. So is that something that got on your radar at all?
Not really, because we really focused primarily on industrial standards and on the nuts and bolts, so to speak, of industry. But contractual. I mean, I'm trying to think of examples of that.
Well, we know that the lawyers who work on standardization like to think about how. So one of the questions you were asking earlier were like reactions to the book. It turns out that we had this big audience that we didn't know existed
of lawyers.
And who knew?
And they're they're scholars, legal scholars, you know,
Yeah.
who are interested in how standards get incorporated into law. And the US has one set of laws around about how you could put it into a law. And the EU has a very different one. Europe has a very different one. And a lot of the lawyers in this country really don't like our system here.
No.
They could have a major problem in it. And so that was a big
and
issue for them. So, you know, we didn't realize that this was an issue sitting out there.
No, and there's this a very strong perception, both by American legal scholars and by European legal scholars, that somehow the European system is better. Although the further we've actually done a little bit of research on this.
So now we're trying to follow this up.
and the further we're getting into it, it's kind of like, actually, maybe that's not true.
The difference is pretty small.
The difference is really smaller than you got. But
some of it is just
but it is true that one of the things that the legal scholars who work on standards, one of the things that is not what they were, you know, responding to our book about, but that they think about, is the way standards are used in contracts to set the, you know, the whole, to make things easier in the future. I mean, just
interesting.
Yeah. But we really didn't get far enough into.
We didn't get far enough into the contractual part of it.
Yeah.
Because we were looking at the industrial standards part of it.
No, I think like I said, I think you've done like an amazing service to the world with what you've done. So it's too big of a problem, you know, it's too big of an issue.
No, it's a huge thing. As I say, it was very interesting to discover that lawyers like the book.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to switch to the research mode, because you guys have also done something interesting, which is you've written a book as a husband and wife team, and this is the first time I've interviewed a team and seen how their collaborative writing process works. I'm interested to learn how you work together too.
Well, let me just, if does it make sense? Oh, I can't do that yet. I need to, shall I share my screen?
Yeah, please do. That'd be great.
Let me just get back to the Zoom screen. I just lost it. Here we go. Okay.
No, that's not
this
really,
one.
You want to share that. Yeah.
And let me blow it up a little bit. Okay, so I just pulled together some examples of the kinds of documents that we looked at as we did it. And I took my examples from radio frequency interference standardization called RFI, or EMC later, that's electromagnetic compatibility. So it's this very obscure but incredibly important area of standardization. And the reason it's so important is, if you think about it, you know, we have our phones. That phone would be interfering with this laptop I'm working on if it weren't for these guys. I mean, they're the ones who keep everything from interfering with everything else. So it's obscure, but it's important. So, you know, we found a few documents like this one. So this one is a 1947 document, report on the meeting of the group of experts held in Lucerne on 22nd through 25th October 1947. So this is right after World War II. So
and that's a document we actually found in the organization, IEC itself.
IEC is the International Electrotechnical Commission, and is the oldest of the international ones still around. It was formed in 1906.
Right. They claimed they didn't have any archival documents, but it turned out they had a basement pool.
Right. When you
wow.
But then, you know, this is an ANSI standard. This is what an American National Standards Institute standard looks like. And you actually, it's hard to get these because you have to pay for them. But we had some good old engineer buddies who helped us with this.
Sure.
But this is what's really hard to get. Now, this is an actual working document of a committee. This is a ballot. You know, they went, this particular standard, C63.4, D5 is for draft 5. This particular one went through something like 11 drafts.
Wow.
And they balloted everyone. So they'd send it out to the people who were on the committee, and they would have to fill in this ballot that you're seeing there. This is one particular person's ballot and has to say, approve with comments. Okay, so he's approved
Wow.
with comments. And this is what we got out of the attics and the basements. These were the things that the actual
people sitting on
chairs
committees
had.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
what they did is they took those and created, that was one, and they got ballots from,
40 members.
40 members of a committee, right? And then they
Wow.
would come up with a table like this. And they would have these tables too, where they take every single comment that anyone made, and they decide. So if you look at this one on 8/12/13, delete to the stage immediately preceding the input of the quasi-peak detector. Okay, and they've said, okay, we can do that.
Wow.
But the one above it, someone suggested that they delete the footnote, but here they say, no,
the
we
footnote
have
is
to revise
absolutely
it.
essential.
So every single ballot on every single draft, they went through this process. So, and this was where, and I found on this one particular standard, they had a whole big fat notebook of all these things and all the ones that went through all the ballots. So it's, seeing that volume of.
And this is
Wow.
when you expand this to the 27,000 committees that are working right now.
Yeah, and this is part of the report they sent on to ANSI. This goes with the table, is this report. And you can also get it on the international level. Here's one from a table made from the international level, and it's the countries who are making the, the country delegations are making not the countries, the governments, but the delegations of engineers from the countries. And they do this again. They either accept something or they, refer to the subcommittee A for future consideration, et cetera. So these kinds of documents are the kinds of things that you can't get in a normal way. You have to get in by going through people who were chairs of these committees, because that's who has these things. And that's where we got them. Now, it's a lot easier now. So IETF, they're all online, right? So this is a request for comment. And that's easy enough to get. Here's one from 1969.
Or W3C. The same level of detail exists in all of these things, but luckily the cloud is filled with.
Yeah, it's easier to get those. So
that's so cool.
Oh, and then the other source that we use a little is photographs. You get some information from photographs. So this is a group of European standardizers who were disembarking from the ship that brought them over from Europe to the US for a meeting, the first meeting to consider an international, they were considering the predecessor of ISO in the interwar years. So this is 1926. And you do learn things from this, including the fact by looking at all the top hats and canes that this is a gentleman's, that being an engineer was a gentleman's role. And this is the founders of ISO after World War II. And, you can figure out, you can identify who they are and who they're representing. And so
and notice that they're all men.
Right. Well,
Exactly.
That too. I think there's a couple women hidden in here. I think, wait a minute.
Yeah,
right,
I can see them.
Right there. But I think she was a secretary for them. You don't really begin getting women
until
into
the
it.
80s.
Yeah, until much later. Yeah, it's a very, that was one thing we learned. It was a very male-dominated field. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's like the history of science. I've been reading a lot of the history of science, and it's just, it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
No,
and engineering was particularly, in some ways, was it more so than science? I don't know. Interesting. I don't know if it was more so or just about the same.
Yeah, certainly it was incredibly gendered. And one of the things that's really interesting, it was actually less racially biased than it was gendered, which is.
Yeah, the gender was stronger than, although, yes and no. We didn't see any African Americans anywhere in it. What we did see was that there was a stage where they were willing to include Japanese.
Well, people from engineers from other parts of the world. So that the first Black engineers that you see are
from other parts of the world.
Are from the Caribbean and from
Oh, interesting.
Not from America.
So what? I have an idea for you. So
Okay.
I watched a couple of other interviews that you've done, and one that you said something along the lines of, that this doesn't kind of save the world, like the idealism is misplaced. But I think, like, if you look at, if you take Steven Pinker's argument that the world is getting better, and you kind of draw a line and you say, maybe all of this interconnectivity that we have through global trade and through communication is actually making the world more peaceful.
Yeah.
Can we actually say that standards are saving the world?
Yeah. Interesting.
Well,
I think it would be a stretch, and I think we'd have trouble convincing a lot of people, but I do think you're right in one sense. I mean, it's not stopping war. It didn't stop World War II from coming along after World War I, and I thought it would.
Interesting.
But I do agree that it's helped make, it's had a huge effect in terms of help making the socioeconomic status of people all over the world better.
Yes.
And that has helped reduce conflict. So
Right.
Is that correct?
I think that's the way that I'd put it that way as well. I mean, Pinker gets some things wrong, but
For sure.
So one of the things that one of his close buddies who actually gets it right is a guy named Joshua Goldstein, who writes about why war is declining. And war is declining not because we're interconnected and because we have greater trade. War, to the extent to which it's declining, is because it's partially that there's people who have a job to make sure that that wars, if they don't break out, it's the United Nations that does it. But the other part of that Goldstein would agree with is actually economic growth is one of the things that has made it possible for fewer wars to take place, the distribution of economic growth around the world. And there's no question, one of my favorite economists and economic historians is Robert Gordon, whose book on the rise and fall of American growth you may have come across, because it does make some of the same kind of argument. But Gordon is like absolutely straight on, where he says, look, without standardization, without what we would call the standards movement, the creation of the goods that actually matter to people in improving their lives just wouldn't have occurred. And so that's, I think, bathrooms, roads, electricity. Those are all things that are deeply connected with standardization. So okay, I'd give
standards save the world. Okay, great.
Standards can save the world in that way. It's not going to save the world necessarily. I'm glad that we're doing other types of technology now, but I like Gordon's ideas about focusing on the technologies that actually really truly improve people's lives. Everyday lives. Those are the ones.
So, related, I can't remember. I was reading the history of the maybe it was the American Standards Association, or I don't even know if that's really, it was some book about the history of standards. But I loved the opening. The foreword was by Vannevar Bush, who of course wrote the Endless Frontier Act and actually shaped the innovation kind of ecosystem, the technology, the techno-scientific world that we live in. I kind of really laid a lot of the foundation for it in the 40s. And standards were important to him. And they were on center stage when you kind of put forward that vision for how we get there. And of course, the Endless Frontier Act has been floating through Congress. I don't know if it's going to be what everyone hoped it would be, but I did see that standards were included in there. It doesn't get a lot of attention. I think kind of where I'm going with this is, where do you hope the the conversation gets to? Like where do you want the standards to fit into the broader kind of innovation and techno-scientific kind of dialogue?
Well, I certainly think it needs to be part of the dialogue, and it has to be explicitly part of the dialogue, and it often gets left out.
I mean, I have one thing that I really care about right now, which is that the arguments that are pushing us toward away from global standards, that are pushing toward creating national or large regional communities of technology, one centered on China, one centered on Europe, one centered on the United States. That's dumb.
Yeah, that's dumb and it's bad.
If you don't understand the standards story, you don't understand how dumb that is. And it's not because standards give us world peace directly. It's because standards give us innovation that can be shared by everybody. Yeah. That's the point.
So I don't know if you ran into or not the IEEE editorial thing we wrote about China and the new, mostly Craig wrote, about the new attempt to, because China has been trying to influence, has been trying to exert power in the standard system. The government has. Some people in the US are saying, this commission said that the US should start as a government exerting power in standards. And we wrote a thing saying that's a really bad idea, that, what has made standards work so well is that it's not a governmental thing. It's not the government, it's the engineers who are the keys here. And
better the companies.
And the companies, not the
but certainly
government.
Better the engineers.
And in fact, as it turns out, as Craig has learned from talking to his friend Wang Ping, in China, that there are a set of standardizers in China who really want to use the system the way it's meant to be used, not let the government be focusing on it. So there are people in China who support the better view of it too. It's just that the Chinese government has also tried to get in there and push its own agenda. But
I mean, the issue is, do we want Rand Paul determining technological standards? That's what
I don't. I want engineers,
and we probably don't. That's it.
So this is I think that's really important, and I'll make sure to link to your paper there, because I think that's I think this is just another example of, standards, because they're so focused on cooperation and not kind of having big egos and not necessarily, I mean, sometimes they're power flexes, but, by and large, when they're successful, it's these feats of cooperation, which are hard to celebrate, because there's, it's like the participation trophies. It's everyone gets one, and there's no heroes for everybody to look up to. So maybe we're onto something with the participation trophy movement.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
So I always end this kind of this interview with a specific question, and it might be relevant for you all, and feel free to interpret it how you will. But I've been trying to figure out how the broader institution of science can improve. And I think there's a lot of people who are working on on these kind of issues and edges and peripheries and thinking about things in new ways. Is there anything that we can learn from standards that we can apply to the broader, like the broader endeavor of science, that you think the community might want to know?
That's interesting. I certainly think it's the case that science also has to have standards, but they tend to think of them in a different way. They think of them as like metrology standards. They have to come up with ways to measure things in science, and that's always the case. Maybe the other one, is the stakeholder notion. I mean, I think scientists, we have this model of science that's the heroic scientist kind of model. Still, yeah. But scientists are embedded within a world that includes companies that are funding them, and that includes, you know, a whole network of other people. And to the extent that cooperation, rather than individual, you know, everyone, instead of individuals trying for their Nobel Prize, you know, maybe we need a Nobel Prize in cooperation.
Or at least greater recognition among scientists that they are serving multiple stakeholders.
Right,
you know,
that they're stakeholders.
A complicated world of multiple stakeholders that are both enabling them, but that they're also, you know, they're also serving.
Yeah, I mean, that's off the top of our heads, so I don't take it.
I love it. I think that's great, and I think that's something that that goes beyond science. I think that goes for you know, you brought up the political aspects, but I think that idea of, and in the book you had the long German word for it, but of including stakeholders. I don't know it off the top of my head, but there is a long German word for this.
There's a long German word.
I don't remember it either.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's something that we could all take away, is that participating in this and learning from that process, the stakeholder process. I think that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you putting up with my questions and my ideas.
Your ideas are really good.
They're really interesting.
Well,
You've asked us some interesting questions we haven't been asked.
That's
so.
right.
Well, I hope we stay in touch. I can't wait to see where you take this next, and I hope that you know, this book continues to be a seed of good conversations and more people getting involved, because I think it's really important. And thank you again for the book. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Bye-bye.